You might not think about firewood until you're cold, but for the people of 18th-century Iceland, firewood wasn't just a convenience, it was survival. And then, it was gone. Let's begin in the year 1707. Iceland, an isolated island clinging to the edge of the North Atlantic, was already used to hardship. Volcanoes regularly blanketed its fields in ash. Winters were long and punishing, and the soil was rocky and acidic. Still, life continued, shaped by a quiet, persistent rhythm. But underneath that rhythm, trouble was growing. By the 18th century, Iceland was almost entirely deforested. That wasn't always the case. When Norse settlers first arrived in the 9th century, the island was covered in birch forests. These weren't towering ancient trees. Birch grows low and slow in the harsh climate, but they were plentiful enough to build homes, boats, and keep the hearth fires burning through the long, dark winters. But birch is delicate and human needs are relentless. Within a few centuries of settlement, most of the forests were cut. Wood was used not just for heat, but for drying fish, making tools, building turf houses, and heating cauldrons of skyr and lye-soaked shark meat. The woodlands never recovered. What did that mean for an island nation with no coal, no industry, and nothing to replace that fuel source? It meant dependence. Icelanders began relying heavily on driftwood logs carried across the North Atlantic from Siberia and North America, deposited randomly on their volcanic shores. But driftwood was unpredictable. One year, a shore might receive dozens of large logs, the next, nothing at all. By 1707, this natural lottery was becoming a national crisis. Some areas, especially in the northwest, received almost no wood at all. Meanwhile, those near the more favored beaches guarded driftwood like treasure. And it truly was. A single large driftwood log could mean the difference between warmth and frostbite, boiled food or raw scraps, for a family during the winter. The shortage wasn't just inconvenient. It affected nearly every aspect of Icelandic life. Cooking, traditional stews, boiled meats, and dairy processing all relied on heat. With no firewood, meals became increasingly raw, cold, or fermented. Heating, most Icelandic homes were turf houses with thick earthen walls, which retained heat, but only if there was heat to begin with. Craftsmanship, without wood, basic tools and structures couldn't be maintained. Many homes collapsed simply because they couldn't be repaired. Medicine, hot herbal treatments were impossible. Patients suffered in unheated rooms, tended by caregivers without warm water or light. Icelanders adapted as humans do. They burned dried sheep dung, a practice that required careful collection, drying, and storage. They gathered seaweed, which gave off an oily, acrid smoke when burned. They used peat, digging blocks of partially decayed moss from wet lowlands and stacking them to dry over the summer. Peat smoke was thick and eye-stinging, but it was heat. And in Iceland, that was enough. Still, it wasn't sustainable. Peatland took centuries to form. Dung required healthy livestock. Seaweed had to be dried, and driftwood was pure chance. None of it could replace the utility and reliability of real wood. In 1755, a Danish magistrate visiting the island noted in his journal that entire families gather for warmth under one sheep hide, lacking flame even for bread. This was the colonial truth of Iceland at the time, a Danish possession, governed remotely and largely ignored until it was in crisis. The firewood crisis slowly became a cultural one. Icelanders began telling stories of the golden logs of old, when fire was common and soup was hot. Children born in the mid-century never knew what it meant to have a consistent hearth. Poets described cold meals in freezing rooms, lit only by fish oil lamps that flickered and spat. Meanwhile, nature offered no help. Volcanic eruptions like those at Hekla and Katla continued to damage farmland. Glacial flooding washed away the best peat-gathering lands, and harsh winters, possibly influenced by the Little Ice Age, extended deep into what should have been spring. By the 1770s, Iceland was facing a silent, creeping collapse. There was no single event, no war, no conquest, no burning disaster, just the slow erosion of comfort, tradition, and warmth. Yet this wasn't the story of a people who gave up. Fishermen developed new smoking methods using fish oil fumes and mineral salts instead of burning wood. Dairymaids learned to ferment skyr in colder temperatures. Tools were bartered and reused across generations. Whole families moved to follow the patterns of driftwood landings, forming a sort of seasonal migration pattern not unlike the movements of birds. One Icelandic priest, John Steingrimsson, noted in 1783 during the Laki eruption an event that would darken the skis for months and kill tens of thousands of livestock that cold is no longer measured in wind or frost, but in absence. Absence of fire, absence of meat, absence of light. Even the churches, once sanctuaries of warmth, went cold. Services were shortened. Parishioners knelt on frozen ground. Sermons were delivered through chattering teeth. This creeping coldness became a national identity. But what happens to a society when even its memories of warmth begin to fade? That question would face Icelanders even more sharply in the last decades of the century, when one of the worst natural disasters in its history would strike just as the last options for firewood truly vanished. It began with a hiss beneath the earth. In June 1783, the Laki fissure system, a 25-kilometer crack in the earth in southern Iceland, ruptured. Over the course of 8 months, an estimated 42 billion tons of basaltic lava and 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide poured into the atmosphere. The eruption didn't come with dramatic explosions. It wasn't like Vesuvius or Krakatoa. Laki seeped, slowly and fatally, producing toxic gas clouds and blanketing the region in thick, cloying haze. This was the beginning of what Icelanders would remember as Mathuharðindin, the mist hardships. And in a country already suffering from extreme firewood scarcity, mist meant something much more dangerous than fog. It meant the death of pastures, the poisoning of sheep and cattle, and the suffocating of the few remaining harvests. It meant no dried dung, no usable seaweed, no driftwood collected on shores the land and its people were choking. The mist that settled. The mist was not just Icelandic. Across Europe, the summer of 1783 was bizarre and unsettling. The skis turned reddish-brown, the sun appeared pale and shrunken. Reports from France, England, and Prussia described mysterious dry fogs, mass crop failures, and dying cattle. But in Iceland, the effects were magnified 100-fold. Sheep collapsed in fields. Their wool yellowed from sulfur exposure. Cows refused to eat scorched hay. Fish left the coastal waters, driven away by underwater chemical shifts. The few food sources the Icelanders relied upon, milk, fish, moss, roots, were vanishing. And without firewood or heat, preserving food became nearly impossible. Winter followed, as it always did, and it was one of the worst the island had ever seen. Imagine trying to survive in a turf house built half-buried into a hillside. Your bedding is made from dried seaweed and animal hides. Your fuel is a mix of peat scraps and dung, which has now been depleted after months of spoiled pasture. You wake in the dark. You go to sleep in the dark. You eat fermented shark and frozen barley paste. There is no wood for a fire, no warmth from an oven, no boiling pot on a hearth. Even the church is closed. There were no official thermometers, but contemporary reports suggest temperatures regularly dropped to -20 degrees C or lower during that winter. Daily life in the cold. The Icelandic Althing, the nation's oldest legislative assembly, could do little. Iceland was still a Danish colony at the time, and while appeals were made to Copenhagen, aid was slow and mostly symbolic. A few barrels of grain, a handful of Danish clerks writing reports. It made little difference. Instead, people turned to one another and to creative adaptations. Communal sleeping. Entire villages would gather in a single turf home, huddling together for warmth. Families shared body heat under sheepskin blankets. Stewing stones. Large rocks were heated, when fuel was available, and wrapped in hides to act as primitive hot water bottles. They were placed in bedding to provide brief warmth. Cold cooking, meals were left to ferment or freeze. Salted fish became a staple. Butter turned rancid, then was eaten anyway. Bread was often made from moss mixed with imported barley husks. Clay lighting. With driftwood nearly gone, oil lamps were made from clay filled with fish oil and moss wicks. These produced more smoke than light, and often blew out in the wind. And yet people still wrote poems. Iceland's rich tradition of rimmer, long narrative poems continued. Many of these described the absence of warmth with an almost sacred reverence. One such verse from 1785 reads, "The hearth is quiet, the cauldron dry. The bread is snow, the lamp a sigh. And still we live, though logs have fled, with ashes cold and sheep long dead." This cultural resilience is striking. With little to no firewood, no industrial support, and no external aid of significance, the people of Iceland survived because of structure, family, faith, familiarity, and an ability to endure discomfort that would unmake most modern societies. A colonial silence. Meanwhile, Denmark remained aloof. From Copenhagen, Iceland was a far-off possession useful mostly for fishing rights and trade monopolies. The Danish crown allowed the Royal Icelandic Trade Monopoly to operate, which meant that Icelanders were not allowed to trade freely. Even importing firewood or coal from elsewhere in Europe was almost impossible due to rigid trade controls. Merchants brought what was cheap and profitable: cod, shark oil, wool, not coal, not timber, not peat bricks. Thus, while cities like London and Paris were beginning to transition to coal-burning hearths and iron stoves, Iceland remained locked in a pre-industrial cycle of scarcity, dictated by outdated laws and geography. Even religious authorities struggled. One bishop, Sigurður Johnson, wrote in 1784 that "we are the land that God has forgotten to warm." His sermons focused not on salvation, but on survival, teaching parishioners how to preserve food without fire, how to layer wool correctly, how to scrape edible lichen from stone. Death was common, and yet Iceland did not fall into chaos. The population dropped by about 20% during the mist hardships, largely from famine and cold-related disease, but communities held together. Local assemblies still met. Folk rituals continued. Rimmer were still sung in cold halls. Flickers of change. It wasn't until the early 19th century that efforts began to meaningfully address the wood scarcity. Forestry projects, encouraged later by Danish reformers and Icelandic nationalists, sought to reintroduce birch groves, albeit with slow results. But the deeper change was psychological. Icelanders began to reframe their relationship with fire. The hearth became not just a tool, but a symbol, a metaphor for memory, for warmth of spirit, for stories passed down when the body could barely endure the cold. And the absence of firewood became part of the nation's self-understanding. It is no coincidence that 19th-century Icelandic literature is filled with references to cold kitchens, frozen bread, and the silence of extinguished flames. The trauma of not having heat, of not even being able to make heat, shaped the culture's voice, its poetry, and its politics. The century ended not in revolution, but in quiet exhaustion. And still the question remained: how would Iceland escape this cycle of scarcity? Could a society based on turf and sheep dung ever move toward modernity? You might assume the story ends with relief, a sudden influx of resources, a shift in fortune, a government stepping in to bring salvation. But in Iceland, change never came quickly. The end of the firewood crisis was not a dramatic rescue, but a drip-drip of adaptation and the slow grind of modernization. And even that began with more hardship. A landscape trying to heal. In the early 1800s, Iceland's environmental condition remained bleak. The land was scarred from centuries of overgrazing, soil erosion, and deforestation. The birch forests that once covered up to 25% of the island were reduced to less than 1%. What little vegetation remained was often used for fodder or fuel, further draining the environment of its ability to recover. Climate, too, was no friend. The Little Ice Age, a period of prolonged cooling that had begun in the 14th century, continued into the early 19th. Summers were too cold for crops, winters too harsh for livestock. The population stagnated, hovering between 40,000 and 50,000. Iceland was still nominally under Danish rule, and most decisions about its resources were made in Copenhagen. One might wonder, why didn't they just import fuel? The answer was complex political, logistical, and cultural. The Danish trade monopoly, which remained in place until 1855, made private imports nearly impossible. The few Danish ships that visited brought expensive goods and took away fish and wool, but fuel was never prioritized. Coal, by the time it became widely used in Europe, was too expensive to transport in bulk to such a remote place with so little purchasing power. Besides, Iceland had no urban centers to concentrate demand. Heating a turf farmstead in a remote fjord with imported coal would have been economically absurd. So the Icelanders waited and worked and changed. The return of trees. In 1882, something quietly monumental happened. The Icelandic Forestry Society was founded. At first, it was more symbolic than practical. The idea of replanting trees, particularly birch, seemed quaint to many. The soil was thin, grazing animals ate new shoots, the growing season was short, and firewood at this point was still being scavenged, scraped, or improvised. But the society persisted. Small birch groves were planted, often fenced off with great effort. Imported trees such as larch and spruce were tested, with varying degrees of success. The Icelandic state supported these efforts, slowly integrating forestry into national policy. By the early 20th century, small-scale sustainable wood harvesting became possible again, but only in certain areas, and only with careful management. Iceland would never again have lush forests, but it had finally begun to understand that even boring, slow change was real change. Geothermal hope. Then something changed that would truly alter the trajectory of Icelandic life. Beneath the volcanic crust, Iceland has always had a secret: heat. The same volcanic activity that caused the Laki eruption and countless other disasters was also quietly bubbling below the surface in a more benign form: geothermal energy. For centuries, Icelanders had used geothermal vents for simple tasks: bathing in hot springs, warming small patches of soil. But in 1909, Reykjavik installed its first primitive geothermal heating system. It was rudimentary, essentially piped hot water from a nearby spring to a school building, but it worked. The warmth was reliable, renewable, and local. It didn't require forests. It didn't depend on the ocean. It wasn't beholden to foreign monopolies. Slowly, other buildings in Reykjavik followed suit. By the 1930s, a full-scale geothermal district heating system was under construction. By the 1970s, most of the capital city and much of the rest of the country was heated with geothermal water. It was, finally, a source of warmth that Iceland could call its own. No more scavenging dung, no more freezing under animal hides, no more driftwood lotteries. Today, Iceland is one of the only countries in the world where nearly 90% of homes are heated by geothermal energy. In an ironic twist, the very geology that had made life so difficult also became its salvation. What firewood left behind? Despite the geothermal revolution, the memory of firewood scarcity never left the culture. In many rural Icelandic households, the hearth remains a central symbol of comfort, not just physical, but emotional. Modern Icelandic design often incorporates a kitchen hearth or wood stove, even if it's decorative. Families light candles in small ceramic replicas of turf houses. Storybooks for children still feature the archetypal scene of a family huddled in a cold room, telling stories to stay warm. The trauma has become ritual. And in a broader sense, Iceland's firewood crisis helped shape its modern identity. Self-sufficiency. Iceland's emphasis on renewable energy, local food, and sustainable fishing owes much to its centuries of isolation and scarcity. Community. Cold winters with no fuel forced families and neighbors to rely on each other. This communal survival instinct continues in Iceland's strong social bonds and cooperative culture. Conservation. Modern forestry programs, national parks, and climate policies are shaped by the hard lessons of erosion, deforestation, and environmental neglect. And yet what happened in the 18th century still lingers in Iceland's subconscious. Many Icelanders today grow up learning the word eldlaus literally, without fire. It is still used figuratively to describe helplessness or hardship. To be eldlaus is not just to be cold. It is to be cut off from possibility, to be trapped by the limits of your environment. Final reflections. What does it mean to live without heat? It's easy to overlook the role of fire in history. We think of wars and kings, revolutions and discoveries. But sometimes, the absence of something like firewood reveals a truer story. The firewood crisis in Iceland wasn't flashy. It had no famous battles, no monuments, no heroic endings. It was made of long winters, bad food, frozen breath, and small acts of endurance. It was boring in the truest historical sense. And yet it shaped everything. Without it, Iceland might not have developed the resilience that defines it today. Without it, the country might never have embraced geothermal innovation. Without it, there might be no poems about cold bread and silent hearths. So as you drift to sleep, imagine this. A turf house under northern stars. A family huddled close, not because they're sentimental, but because they must be. Outside, the wind carries nothing, no logs, no heat, no rescue. But inside, someone recites a verse. Someone mends a boot. Someone places a moss-wrapped rock at their feet. It is not warm, but it is enough. When you think of the Great Wall of China, you probably imagine a monumental symbol of strength and grandeur, serpentine towers stretching across rugged mountains, imposing and eternal. What we don't often think about is the mud in the laborers' shoes, the dry millet porridge in their bowls, or the long, silent deaths behind the mortar. But the Great Wall, particularly during the Ming Dynasty, when much of the structure we see today was built, wasn't just a feat of engineering. It was a bureaucratic, logistical, and human ordeal of staggering scale. And behind every gray stone was a series of mundane, exhausting, and often tragic decisions. How to move bricks up a cliff, how to feed 10,000 men with no harvest, how to keep soldiers awake on freezing night shifts with no fire. This is the story not of the wall itself, but of the boring, grinding infrastructure that made it possible. A wall built over centuries. To begin, it's worth clarifying that there isn't just one Great Wall. The earliest defensive walls in China go back as far as the 7th century BCE, when competing northern kingdoms built rudimentary ramparts to protect themselves from raids. Over centuries, these fortifications were expanded, destroyed, and rebuilt in different places by different dynasties. The Qin, the Han, the Sui, and much later the Ming. The Qin dynasty, 221–206 BCE, is often credited with unifying earlier walls into a continuous defensive line, but their construction was mostly tamped earth, a kind of thick, compressed mud reinforced with twigs, gravel, and straw. It was not glamorous. It was not durable, and it certainly wasn't beautiful. It was built fast, using tens of thousands of conscripted peasants and prisoners. Later dynasties continued this tradition, with varying levels of effort. But it was during the Ming Dynasty, 1368–1644, after the expulsion of the Mongol Yuan rulers, that the Great Wall became a strategic priority. The goal was not just defense, but a reassertion of Chinese control, physical, political, and psychological. The Ming emperors wanted a wall that would last, and that required more than bricks. It required an entire economy of suffering. Logistics before machinery. Imagine the challenge. You're tasked with building a defensive wall along mountainous terrain stretching for thousands of kilometers. There are no trucks, no cranes, no trains. You have oxen, donkeys, and human backs. How do you move millions of tons of material? You don't always. In many regions, the Ming builders relied heavily on local materials. This is why different segments of the wall look so different. In the mountains of Hebei, they used stone. In the western deserts of Gansu, they used straw and reed-reinforced rammed earth. In other places, especially near Beijing, they used kiln-fired bricks and lime mortar, a luxury product, manufactured on-site. Kilns had to be built wherever bricks were needed. The fuel wood, coal, or dried dung had to be gathered nearby, often leading to widespread deforestation. Bricks were fired in long rows and carried up slopes in baskets on workers' backs. A single brick might weigh 10–12 pounds, and most workers carried two at a time, walking uphill all day long. To climb a steep segment of the wall near Jiangku, for example, would require ascending over 45 degrees for several kilometers. Imagine doing that every day for months. And that's just materials. Consider the other needs. Food for workers and soldiers. Water transported to dry regions. Shelter built from temporary wood, cloth, or turf. Tools forged and constantly repaired. Paperwork, because even in the 15th century, there was bureaucracy. The Ming military was responsible for a large portion of wall construction. Soldiers were rotated between garrison duty and construction work, but the work was brutal and often fatal. Many died of exposure, malnutrition, or accidents. Some simply disappeared, buried in landslides or pressed into the wall itself, giving rise to legends of ghost bricks and walls made with human bones. Feeding the machine. Perhaps the most difficult part of the wall's construction was feeding the people who built it. In remote regions, supply chains stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Food, usually grain, dried vegetables, or salted meat, had to be moved by cart, boat, or backpack. Every step of that supply chain required its own laborers, guards, paperwork, and rest stations. Here's a typical ration for a wall laborer in the Ming era. 2 caddies approx, 1 kg of millet or sorghum per day. Occasionally, salted turnips or cabbage. Boiled water or thin gruel called zifen, a rice water drink. On rare occasions, bean paste or meat scraps. Most workers ate 2 meals per day, usually cold. Fires were hard to maintain on the wall, especially in stone sections with no fuel nearby. In cold seasons, food froze. In hot seasons, it spoiled. And when it failed to arrive, people ate grass, bark, or cattle feed. One report from 1572 describes laborers at a northern outpost boiling leather straps for soup. Disease outbreaks were common, particularly dysentery and scurvy. The administrative paper blizzard. You might expect that such suffering would go unrecorded, but the Ming bureaucracy was astonishingly thorough, if not always effective. Records show exact brick counts for individual wall segments. Daily labor logs. Lists of injuries and illnesses. Reports on grain rot, oxen death, and tool theft. Letters of complaint from minor officials. The lime is of poor quality and makes the mortar brittle, one reads. Much of the construction was overseen by local magistrates and military supervisors. Corruption was rampant. It was not uncommon for an overseer to report a completed stretch of wall when, in fact, only a fraction had been built. Others would pocket wages or food rations meant for laborers. One case from the 1580s describes a regional officer who reported building 12 li, about 6 km of wall, but an audit revealed only 4 li completed. The rest was cleverly disguised with scaffolding and piles of unused stone. The punishment: a severe public beating and a reduction in rank, and likely no wall at all in that region for several more years. But despite all of this, the wall did grow section by slow section. By the late 1500s, the Ming Wall stretched over 5,500 miles. It was not continuous, it was not impervious, but it existed, and it shaped military and civilian life in northern China. Wall culture, life along the line. The wall was more than stone and labor. It was a lived space, a place where people were born, raised, stationed, and buried. Garrisons dotted the wall's length. Each had its own rhythm. Watch rotations every few hours. Torch signals to alert neighboring posts. Night patrols, even in snow and rain. Periodic training drills, overseen by bored or brutal officers. Many soldiers brought their families. Small villages sprang up along the wall, often providing food, tools, and laundry services to the garrisons. These communities became intergenerational, with sons following fathers into garrison life. For many, the wall was the only world they knew. Folk songs from the 16th century describe women weaving blankets and sending millet cakes to their husbands on the North Line. Others lament the cold wind, the howling wolves, and the silence between distant towers. One verse goes, "No drum, no horn, just stone and sky. We walk, we lift, we never ask why." The wall is not built in a day or a year, but in the echoes of men who disappear. By now you might wonder, was it worth it? Did all this hardship, death, and bureaucracy actually work? The answer is not simple. The wall did deter small raids and allow for early warning signals. It also served as a symbol and immense psychological barrier to invaders. But in the early 17th century, the Manchu tribes from the northeast would bypass the wall, defeat the Ming, and found the Qing dynasty. The wall didn't stop them. But for nearly 300 years, it shaped the lives of millions not through glory or conquest, but through dusty roads, missing rations, and the aching backs of anonymous men hauling bricks. To understand the purpose of the Great Wall is to understand that it was never just a barrier. It was a network, a surveillance system, a signal relay, a human-powered early warning mechanism spread thinly across a hostile frontier. While the bricks and battlements draw the eye, it was the mundane logistics of watchkeeping, signaling, and administration that allowed the wall to operate as more than a static monument. This was a system designed not for heroics, but for endurance of soldiers, of messages, and of quiet repetition. Let us walk, then, from stone to signal fire. The towers that watched the world. Dotting the length of the Ming-era wall were beacon towers, stone or earth towers placed at regular intervals, most within visual range of the next. In flat terrain, they might stand 5 to 8 meters high. In mountainous regions, they could reach 15 meters or more. These towers were not luxurious. Most lacked roofs. Soldiers stationed in them were exposed to snow, rain, wind, and sun. The interiors were cramped, often with only a single floor and a narrow ladder. There were no beds, just woven mats or piles of straw. Inside each tower, a small team of sentinels kept vigil. Their job was as dull as it was critical. Scan the horizon. Maintain the fire pit. Prepare signal materials, dried grass, wolf dung, or gunpowder. Relay messages. That was it all day, every day, for months or even years. In peacetime, these towers communicated little. Most shifts passed in silence. But when the wall served its purpose as a platform for visibility, these towers became the backbone of the empire's first fast communication system. Fire and smoke, the signal code. The Ming military developed a standardized signal system, using smoke during the day and fire at night. One Ming manual describes the signal code. One column of smoke equals fewer than 100 enemy troops spotted. 2 columns equals 500 troops. 3 columns equals 1,000 or more. 4 or more columns equals a full-scale invasion. At night, the number of torch fires followed a similar code. But the towers weren't just broadcasting vague warnings, they were also part of a chain reaction. When one tower saw the signal from its neighbor, it replicated it. In this way, a sighting in the far north could be relayed hundreds of kilometers in hours, assuming clear weather. This was revolutionary for the time. But it came with constraints. Visibility, fog, storms, or even dust could interrupt the chain. Labor, firewood, and signal fuel had to be stored, maintained, and rationed. Accuracy, misreading a fire or failing to spot it could result in panic or disaster. Fatigue, watchmen fell asleep, fires went out, complacency set in. And yet, for a pre-telegraph world, this system was remarkably effective if the human parts held together. Life in garrison. Beyond the watchtowers, the wall was staffed by thousands of garrison soldiers, often stationed in fortresses or watchposts every few kilometers. These weren't grand castles, they were functional complexes, built from stone or tamped earth, housing. Sleeping quarters, shared bunk platforms. Latrines, open pits if at all. Kitchens, simple hearths, if firewood was available. Grain stores, mud-sealed silos to protect from rats. Armories with bows, swords, and later early firearms. Soldiers followed strict routines. Morning drills. Midday wall patrols. Afternoon maintenance, shoring up loose stones, repairing steps. Evening roll calls. Night watches. The average garrison soldier rarely saw combat. Their role was preventative, to present a visible deterrent and keep communication flowing. Yet many still died from exposure, scurvy, dysentery, or boredom. To cope, soldiers developed rituals, singing wall songs, carving poems into bricks, trading stories of distant invaders. Occasionally, they brewed millet wine or chewed on spiced tree bark as a bitter stimulant during night shifts. One recovered diary from a soldier named Liang Yu, dated to 1604 records. It is not war that kills us, but the cold wind, the cracked boots, and the silence. A man can forget his name staring into the same hills each day. Civilian support in wall towns. Though the wall is often imagined as standing apart from society, in many regions it birthed supporting communities. These were wall towns, civilian settlements that sprang up to supply the garrisons and benefit from military demand. Some were seasonal encampments, others grew into permanent villages. Their inhabitants included blacksmiths forging tools and arrowheads, tailors sewing winter uniforms and bedding, women washing clothes or cooking for troops, grain merchants transporting millet and wheat, children many of whom would grow up to serve on the wall. These communities lived in the shadow of the wall, not under threat, but under routine. They followed military schedules, heard the same warning drums, endured the same ration shortages. And in times of invasion, they were often the first to flee. The quiet threats. One of the less discussed functions of the wall was internal control. In addition to defending against foreign incursions, the Great Wall also served as a line of administrative containment. It demarcated tax zones, limited unauthorized migration, and discouraged banditry and desertion. It was not uncommon for the wall's watchmen to arrest fleeing peasants, escaping drought or tax collectors, deserters attempting to leave their posts, unauthorized traders, smuggling goods between tribes and border towns, nomads crossing without tribute. The wall, in this sense, was not just defensive, it was a mechanism of surveillance, one that imposed order as much as it provided safety. But its effectiveness always hinged on the same thing: people staying awake, following protocol, and reporting what they saw. And that, too, was its greatest weakness: the fatigue of an empire. By the late 1500s, The Ming dynasty was under growing strain. Natural disasters, peasant rebellions, and bureaucratic gridlock sapped its strength. Even the wall felt this fatigue. Sections went unrepaired for decades. Signal towers crumbled or burned. Supply lines failed, leaving garrisons undersupplied. Corruption spread, with fake reports and ghost soldiers listed for pay. One report from 1609 records a military inspector discovering that a 15 km section near present-day Shanxi was maintained by 300 men on paper, but only 28 in the flesh. And when the Manchu forces began their rise to power in the early 1600s, they found ways to go around, bribe through, or overwhelm these weakened defenses. The wall signaled, but there was often no one left to answer. A long line of waiting. Still, for more than 250 years, the Great Wall under the Ming stood not as an impenetrable fortress, but as a system of patience. It was powered by thousands of individual decisions, millions of small footsteps, endless repetition of simple tasks: signal, report, patrol, repair. It was not grand strategy that sustained it, but daily maintenance: mortar mixed by hand, fire pits kept dry, grain measured and distributed. The wall did not keep invaders out forever, but it held the silence, maintained the signal, and bought time decade after decade. Yet as the 17th century dawned, a final question loomed. When the signal fires burned one last time, would anyone be watching? The sun rises on the wall one more time. Not with fanfare, not with thunderous drums, but in silence broken only by the wind pushing dust across old stones. The year is 1644. The Ming dynasty is collapsing, and the Great Wall, once the beating spine of the empire's defense, now stands watching, powerless to halt the tide that will sweep over it. This final chapter is not about the conquest of the wall, but its transformation from a working defense system into a ghost of effort. A monument to bureaucracy, suffering, and perseverance, reduced over centuries to scattered bricks and tourist trails. Let's look at what happened when the wall stopped being watched. The fall of the Ming and the wall. The Manchus, a semi-nomadic people from Northeast Asia, had long maintained trade and diplomatic contact with the Ming court. But by the early 17th century, as Ming stability eroded due to economic turmoil, climate instability, and internal rebellion, the Manchu military grew more assertive. They didn't initially want to conquer China, they wanted recognition and autonomy. But Ming leaders mishandled the relationship. Raids escalated, walls were repaired in haste, garrisons were rotated erratically, supplies dried up. In 1644, facing both a Manchu advance and a massive internal rebellion led by Li Zicheng, the Ming commander of the key Shanhai Pass, Wu Sangui, made a fateful decision. He opened the gates to the Manchu army, allowing them through the Great Wall to defeat the rebels and take Beijing. This wasn't a dramatic breach of an impenetrable wall. It wasn't a siege. It was a political calculation and invitation. And so, the wall's ultimate failure wasn't architectural or military. It was human. No amount of rammed earth, stonework, or signal fires could withstand a system that no longer believed in its own purpose. The Great Wall had become an aging spine, rigid, expensive, hollowed out by years of neglect. Life after defense, the wall forgotten. Under the Qing dynasty, 1644–1912, the wall lost much of its strategic value. The Manchus now ruled both sides of it. The need for a massive frontier defense was gone. Some garrisons remained, especially in the west where banditry and skirmishes continued. But most towers were abandoned, and with no routine patrols, the infrastructure deteriorated rapidly. Bricks were taken by locals to build homes and farms. Wooden gates and ladders rotted or were burned for fuel. Kilns were repurposed for pottery and lime production. Military stations became granaries or stables. Roads over the wall eroded, turning to dust trails. By the mid-18th century, large sections of the wall, especially those far from cities, had vanished from state records entirely. Imperial bureaucrats no longer mentioned them. Maps often skipped them. One Qing-era poem notes, "Once a line between fear and calm. Now grass grows where men once stood. No horn sounds, no torch flares. Only the shepherd sleeps by stone." The wall faded, not in defeat but in irrelevance. Local reuse and reclamation. In the centuries that followed, local populations repurposed the Great Wall with remarkable efficiency. A villager might dismantle a wall segment to build a courtyard wall, a pigsty, a well lining, a hearth base, even millstones from large paving slabs. This wasn't done with malice or rebellion. It was a pragmatic act. The empire was distant. The wall was useless. Stone, on the other hand, was heavy, rare, and perfect for building. Peasants carved names and dates into exposed bricks. Children played on crumbling battlements. Goatherds led their animals along the paths once used by soldiers. And so the wall returned to the people not as a defense system, but as material memory. Rediscovery through decay. By the 19th century, foreign explorers and scholars began taking an interest in China's ancient ruins. The Great Wall, largely ignored by Qing officials, became a curiosity in European writings. Travel journals spoke of mysterious ramparts and the endless wall, often with exaggerated romanticism. But the wall was not ready for admiration. Much of it had fallen to ruin. Towers leaned precariously. Stones were cracked or missing. Only in a few preserved sections near Beijing did the wall still resemble its former form. In the 20th century, as China entered periods of warlordism, civil war, Japanese invasion, and revolution, preserving the wall was not a priority. Mao Zedong famously said, "You are not a real man until you have climbed the Great Wall." But under his rule, many parts of the wall continued to be dismantled or neglected. Construction projects, dams, and roads often carved straight through ancient sections. In some cases, military bases were built on top of former garrisons. It wasn't until the late 20th century, particularly the 1980s, that serious efforts were made to protect and restore segments of the wall. China recognized it not only as a historical artifact, but a powerful tool of national identity and tourism. The wall is memory. Today, the Great Wall is often seen as a unified symbol, but in truth, it is a fragmented echo of many walls, many lives, and many forgotten stories. The men who hauled bricks up mountains are unnamed. The women who carried soup to frozen garrisons are unrecorded. The officials who stamped ration forms in the snow, who counted arrows in the dark, who buried comrades under wall stones, none are remembered in textbooks. Yet their work shaped centuries of border life. In this way, the Great Wall stands not just as a feat of engineering, but as a monument to routine, repetition, and response. It is a reminder that much of history is not made by sudden change, but by unseen persistence. Every stone in the wall was lifted by a hand. Every tower stood because someone tended its fire. Modern preservation and modern myths. Since 1987, the Great Wall has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Restoration efforts focus mostly on popular sections: Badaling, Muxianyu, Jinshanling, where tourists walk, snap photos, and marvel. But vast stretches remain untouched. Some are lost under desert sand. Others have crumbled into indistinct ridges. In Gansu and Inner Mongolia, farmers still walk their fields along paths lined with collapsed wall foundations. Meanwhile, myths persist. That the Great Wall is visible from space, it is not, at least not without aid. that the entire wall was built in one dynasty. It was not its a palimpsest. That the wall kept China safe for thousands of years. Its impact was partial, inconsistent, and deeply human. The truth is less cinematic but more compelling. Because the Great Wall is not just about defense. It is about how hard it is to keep anything going. It is about cold fingers tightening mortar, about misread smoke signals, about the 8th time you climb the tower and still see nothing on the horizon. It is about a country building anyway. What remains? When we look at the Great Wall today, we see a powerful visual line. But what lingers most is the quiet weight of the past. The calloused hands of conscripts, the unrecorded cries of the sick, the tedium of torch duty, the thousand fires that burned just long enough. The wall did not fall because it was weak. It faded because the people who needed it stopped believing in what it protected. And in that, there is something profoundly human. A reminder that even the greatest defenses erode not with siege engines, but with neglect, fatigue, and forgetting. The Roman Empire was a marvel of planning, paved roads, and disciplined marching. It had aqueducts, a census system, postal routes, and a vast network of interconnected cities. But for all its grandeur, the empire also had one of the most mundane vulnerabilities you can imagine. A shortage of salt. Yes, salt. Not gold, not soldiers, not weapons, salt. In the 3rd century CE, as the Roman Empire strained under pressure from external invasions and internal fractures, a quiet and slow-moving crisis unfolded. Roman legions, scattered across the provinces, began receiving fewer shipments of salted rations, resulting in fatigue, desertions, and systemic supply chain breakdowns. This isn't the story of a battle or a heroic campaign. It's the story of spoiled meat, rotting cartloads of fish, and logistical chaos stretching from the North African coast to the forests of Germania, and how this boring crisis almost unmade the empire's most powerful institution, its army. Why salt mattered so much. To understand the severity of this crisis, we need to grasp how critical salt was to Roman life. Salt preserved food. Roman soldiers, especially those far from urban centers, relied on salted pork, fish, and cheese for survival. Without refrigeration, perishable supplies had to be heavily salted to withstand long transport. A typical Roman military ration included salted pork perna, salted fish or garum, salted cheese and dried grains, hard biscuits or panis militaris. These rations were meant to last weeks at a time. When armies marched or worse, camped through winter, salted provisions were everything. Salt also had economic value. Soldiers were sometimes paid in salt or given a salt allowance, hence the origin of the word salary, from the Latin salarium. And finally, salt was a matter of health. Without it, soldiers suffered cramps, weakness, and fatigue, particularly under heavy armor in warm climates. In short, without salt, the legions didn't fight. They barely functioned. The 3rd century crisis, a perfect storm. In the early 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire entered what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 CE. It was a period marked by rapid turnover of emperors, some reigns lasted just months, invasions by Germanic tribes and Persian forces, civil wars and breakaway provinces, economic instability and currency devaluation, plague and drought. But underneath these dramatic headlines was the slow unraveling of the imperial logistics network, the arteries and veins that kept Rome's army fed and mobile. Salt supplies, in particular, became erratic. Why? Because salt production required stability. Much of Rome's salt came from coastal evaporation ponds in Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa, underground salt mines in central Italy and Dacia, salted fish factories along the Mediterranean. These facilities depended on skilled labor, safe roads, guarded coastlines, functioning taxation systems, grain, firewood, and pottery to pack and transport the salt. When provinces revolted or when local governors declared themselves emperors, these industries collapsed or became corrupted. Salt was hoarded, sold on black markets, or simply stopped flowing. One report from 260 CE in the region of Riesia, modern-day Switzerland and southern Germany, notes that garrisons had to kill livestock on the spot because no salt had arrived in 6 months. The meat spoiled within days. Soldiers were reduced to eating burnt flesh or unsalted grain. The invisible enemy, spoilage. If you're imagining a scene of hungry soldiers dying in battle, dial it back. The problem was rarely starvation. Rome had grain. The problem was decay. Meat spoiled quickly in summer heat. Fish rotted during transport. Without salt, cartloads of supplies had to be discarded. Legionaries sometimes refused rations if they smelled wrong, leading to disputes, floggings, and even mutinies. Here are some of the problems Roman quartermasters faced. Saltless barrels caused fish to disintegrate into sludge. Insect infestations bloomed in improperly sealed cheese wheels. Delays at river crossings meant shipments spoiled before reaching camps. Local suppliers inflated prices or diluted salt with sand. All of this had a compounding effect. Sick soldiers couldn't train. Weakened units fell behind during marches. Rear logistics slowed, creating further shortages. Desertions increased, especially in border provinces. Morale dropped, and with it discipline. One soldier, a veteran from the Danube frontier, reportedly said, "We fight barbarians by day and belly rot by night." Attempts to fix the problem. Emperors were not blind to the crisis. Some issued emergency edicts to address salt shortages. The Emperor Aurelian, R. 270–275 CE, known for his practical reforms, attempted to expand salt tax revenues to fund salt transport, build more salt depots along military routes, establish state-owned Salini saltworks to replace private suppliers, punish hoarding with imprisonment or seizure. But even these measures had limits. You can't harvest salt without peace. You can't build storage without labor. You can't march salted pork across raider-filled forests. In short, you can't legislate a supply chain into existence if the infrastructure is broken. Salt's role in fragmentation. While salt wasn't the cause of Rome's fragmentation, its shortage symbolized deeper cracks in the empire. When the Gallic Empire, 260–274 CE, broke away from Rome, taking with it Hispania, Gaul, and Britain, it cut off access to key saltworks. Roman generals in the West had to fend for themselves. Many began sourcing salt locally, bartering with tribal leaders, or producing low-grade replacements that lacked adequate preservative quality. The result: a patchwork of inconsistent provisioning, decline in standardized rations, growing resentment among soldiers who compared their meals with former comrades. These tensions, though seemingly minor, amplified political instability. Food grievances became tied to loyalty. Generals who could feed their troops gained more support even if it meant breaking from the central empire. A fractured salt supply became a metaphor for a fractured Rome. Salt and the Roman mindset. Beyond its practical uses, salt had deep cultural importance. In Roman tradition, newborns were rubbed with salt as a form of purification. Salt was offered in religious rituals alongside grain and wine. Salted bread and meat were associated with civilization itself, unlike the raw diets of so-called barbarians. To march without salt wasn't just uncomfortable, it was barbaric. It made a legion feel exposed, uncared for, and somehow less Roman. In this way, the salt shortage eroded not just supplies, but identity. The slow rebuild. By the end of the 3rd century, under the reforms of Diocletian, R 280–305 CE, Rome began to regain control of its logistical systems. Diocletian reorganized provinces, making smaller units easier to manage, doubled the number of administrative districts, created mobile field armies less reliant on massive supply trains, revived salt taxes and public salt works, putting them under direct imperial control. He also introduced price controls, including fixed prices for salt and salted foods in the famous Edict on Maximum Prices, 301 CE. But the damage had been done. The dream of unified, smooth Roman logistics never fully returned. The salt supply stabilized in parts of the empire, but provisioning remained fragile, especially as more pressure came from outside. In the end, this wasn't a story of catastrophe. It was a story of slow failure, of missed shipments, moldy cheese, and fish too foul to eat. It was about the unnoticed collapse of systems that seem too boring to fail until they do. And even the most disciplined army cannot march on rotting pork and dry biscuits forever. When historians speak of Rome, they often emphasize conquest, administration, and law. But behind every conquest was a cart, and behind every law was a ledger. The Roman Empire was not sustained by glory, it was held together by supplies. And in the 3rd century CE, just as the empire teetered from one internal crisis to another, the slow grinding machinery of logistics, particularly salt and grain, began to seize up. In this section, we turn from the missing salt barrels to the broader infrastructure that surrounded them. The carts, rivers, way stations, and storehouses. The contracts, corruptions, and calculations that determined whether a soldier at the frontier received a barrel of garum or a bowl of porridge scraped from moldy sacks. Feeding the empire, more than bread and circus. The Roman military had always relied on two foundational pillars of nutrition, grain and salt. Grain was the core of the diet: millet, wheat, or barley, often baked into hard bread or boiled into pools, a type of porridge. Salt preserved the protein: pork, fish, cheese, and sometimes beans or vegetables. For flavor, the army used garum, a pungent fermented fish sauce that was also rich in protein and salts. It was traded widely across the Mediterranean. But none of this food grew at the frontier. It had to be moved, and moving anything in Rome was a feat of paperwork, coordination, and friction. How Rome moved its food. Rome's supply network was complex, but remarkably efficient when it worked. Production zones. North Africa, grain, olives, and salt from evaporation pans. Sicily and Egypt, high-volume wheat and barley. Gaul and Hispania, garum factories, livestock, and cheese. Dalmatia and Dacia, salt mines and timber for barrels. Transport systems. Via roads, carefully measured routes lined with milestones used for ox carts and foot transport. Rivers, barges moved goods downstream quickly but struggled upstream. Mare Nostrum, the Mediterranean. Merchant ships moved large shipments efficiently, but where seasonal storms often closed ports in winter. Way stations, mansions, and mutations. Places for travelers and carts to rest. Provided food, water, and fresh animals. Became impromptu storage nodes when delays or shortages backed up supplies. Storehouses Horia. Built in major cities and military outposts. Designed with raised floors and ventilation to prevent spoilage. Required trained administrators, called horire, to monitor stocks. What went wrong? By the mid-3rd century, this system began to fray. Roads fell into disrepair in contested provinces. Pirates returned to the Mediterranean, targeting supply ships. Corrupt officials siphoned food, meant for the army to sell locally at inflated prices. Inflation made state-issued coinage worthless to contractors. droughts in North Africa, and the Levant reduced surplus grain. A key report from a garrison near the Rhine frontier in 261 CE notes, "We have been issued flour but no oil, cheese is spoiled, garum is lost, the bread is moldy and broken by rats, 2 oxen dead on the road, we expect no barrels before snow." Another from Noricum in modern Austria includes a sobering line. "The soldiers ask not for more wine, but for the salt to preserve their meat." Bureaucracy meets disaster. The Roman bureaucracy was vast and detailed. Every item had to be logged, tallied, and cross-checked. When the system worked, it allowed for meticulous provisioning. But when it didn't, it became a trap of red tape and blame shifting. Here's a glimpse of how slow things could become. A shipment of garum barrels is delayed in Brundisium. A local official reroutes it through a longer, safer road without filing the change. The quartermaster at Aquileia waits. Soldiers grow restless, rations are cut. When the barrels finally arrive 2 weeks late, half are spoiled, and the paperwork triggers a corruption inquiry. A clerk is arrested, a centurion is reassigned, but the food is still gone. And it wasn't just food. Salted equipment like hide armor, leather harnesses, and oiled ropes also began to degrade without proper treatment. One dismal inventory from 267 CE lists: 700 tunics, 200 with mold; 400 sandals, 118 unusable; 200 water skins leaking; 38 shields warped from damp storage; 10 barrels of fish infested; 3 sealed but empty barrels marked salt pork; garum, liquid gold, and spoiled luxury. Among the most coveted military provisions was garum, Rome's favorite sauce and protein supplement. Garum was more than a condiment. It was a caloric necessity for legions stationed in areas where fresh fish or meat was scarce. A few spoonfuls added to grain could simulate a meal. It also carried essential sodium and amino acids. But garum had a vulnerability. It needed airtight ceramic containers called amphorae, careful aging, and constant quality control. If left too long or improperly sealed, it became toxic. In 3rd century records, several garum-related issues appear. Entire shipments were dumped due to overpowering rot. Amphorae cracked in freezing conditions. Workers in garum factories went on strike after wages were unpaid during a regional revolt. One case in Pannonia documents soldiers hallucinating after consuming spoiled garum stored in reused wine jugs. Yet even spoiled, garum was sometimes distributed anyway because there were no alternatives. Salt as a political weapon. The scarcity of salt also made it a tool of influence. Provincial governors or ambitious generals, many of whom were vying for control during the era's civil wars, used food, especially salt, as leverage. Promise salt and win loyalty. Withhold salt and break morale. There are records of commanders controlling salt roads during campaigns, limiting its flow to rival factions or rebellious legions. One such episode, recorded during the rise of Postumus, self-declared emperor of the Gallic Empire, describes his forces raiding salt caravans en route to Italy not for profit, but to undermine Rome's loyalist forces. Local substitutes and desperation. As imperial logistics floundered, local commanders had to get creative. Common substitutes included ash-soaked brine, made from boiled plant ash and river water; smoked meats, preserved with regional herbs; undersalted rations, packed with vinegar to reduce spoilage. These were stopgaps. Soldiers noticed, complaints continued. Some legions resorted to shortened training days due to fatigue, redistributing rations, skipping meals so 1 day per week could include salted pork, bartering with locals, even in enemy territory, to buy salt at high cost. And still the salt barrels remained few, and sometimes empty. And yet they marched. Despite all of this, the Roman army endured. In the 270s, under Aurelian, Rome began to reclaim control. Salt production was partially restored. Strategic roads were fortified. Regional commanders were recalled or replaced. But the memory of shortage lingered. Veteran soldiers, especially those who'd served in the worst-hit areas, often demanded more stable postings or extra food compensation. Salt became a badge of loyalty, and its absence a sign of betrayal. By 284, when Diocletian began his reforms, he made salt provisioning a state priority, embedding it into the empire's reorganized taxation and military structure. It was recognition that the empire, for all its power, had nearly unraveled not from defeat, but from dehydration and rot. Imagine the scene: a legion at the edge of empire, tired, underpaid, and unsalted. A commander unfolds a scroll. The next shipment is delayed, again. The men grumble. They chew their hard bread. One glares at the horizon, wondering not when the next battle will come, but when the next barrel of salt will arrive. Because sometimes, the thing that breaks an empire is not the spear. It's the cart that never comes. By now, you've walked the dusty roads of the empire. You've stood beside salt barrels that never arrived, read rosters that showed more mold than men, and watched soldiers chew sour bread in silence. There were no drums of war in this story, no grand betrayal, just the slow, grinding collapse of a supply system that once fed the greatest army in the world. In this final section, we explore how the absence of salt and the fragile infrastructure that failed to deliver it did more than weaken legions. It signaled the deeper unraveling of an empire built on order, but increasingly ruled by improvisation and erosion. When soldiers stopped marching, the Roman military strength had always rested on a careful balance of reliable logistics, predictable discipline, clear hierarchy, civic integration. Each piece relied on the others. Food ensured morale. Morale ensured discipline. Discipline ensured loyalty. But once the supply lines faltered, especially during the 3rd century crises, the army began to shift. Rather than quit, Roman soldiers adapted. But that adaptation came at a cost. Here, what changed? Self-provisioning. Legions began sourcing food locally, often through forced requisition, barter, or extortion. This alienated civilian populations. Dispersed encampments. Without centralized provisioning, soldiers lived in spread-out formations to better forage. This weakened cohesion and response times. Shorter enlistment terms. Young recruits were reluctant to serve full-length campaigns if basic needs weren't met. Rise of mercenaries. Commanders increasingly hired non-Roman fighters, Germanic auxiliaries, Sarmatians, Syrians who brought their own logistical expectations. In short, the Roman army stopped being Roman in structure, even if it still flew Roman banners. The absence of something as dull as salt revealed a deeper truth. The empire was no longer capable of sustaining itself uniformly. A world of barrels and bandits. In the early 4th century, salt and the infrastructure to carry it became one of the key markers between stable Rome and frontier Rome. In central Italy and key cities like Antioch or Carthage, salt was still stocked in warehouses. Garum was traded in open markets. Salt tax records were filed. But along the Danube, Rhine, and Hadrian's Wall, things looked different. Salt barrels arrived irregularly, if at all. Local warlords controlled salt routes. Soldiers built clay ovens to smoke meats instead of relying on brine supplies. Entire forts were abandoned simply because no food could be stored safely. This quiet retreat wasn't driven by enemy swords, it was driven by logistics fatigue. Why guard a post that couldn't even feed its garrison? In northern Gaul, archaeological digs show evidence of Roman forts gradually shifting into farming hamlets, with former watchtowers used to hang meats, store grain, and raise chickens. The wall hadn't fallen, it had melted into the landscape. Diocletian's fixes and their limits. We must give credit to Diocletian, the emperor who ruled from 284 to 305 CE, for recognizing the rot beneath Rome's surface. His sweeping reforms attempted to divide the empire for better management, the tetrarchy, tie farmers to their land, precursor to serfdom, to ensure stable food supplies, expand the annona militaris, a state-administered tax-in-kind system that requisitioned food and materials including salt for the army, standardize prices including salt under the Edict on Maximum Prices, 301 CE. But even these measures came too late for many regions. Frontier garrisons continued to suffer. Salt shipments were prioritized to imperial centers, leaving remote units to fend for themselves. And perhaps most telling, barter replaced currency in many transactions. Soldiers were more likely to trade for salt than expected in their rations. By the early 5th century, even Rome's famed legions were no longer truly Roman. They were patchworks of local recruits, mercenaries, and former enemies, held together by promises of land, not state provisioning. Salt as memory. Despite its fatting practical role, salt lingered in cultural memory. Oaths in late antiquity were still sworn by salt and bread. Christian monasteries kept salt cellars on altars. Roman-era cookbooks included instructions for pickling and curing, often with nostalgic introductions about the flavors of the legions. Funeral rites still involved salted bread, symbolizing preservation and legacy. Even after the empire's western half officially fell in 476 CE, salt remained a symbol of order, discipline, and structure, things the empire had once offered, but no longer maintained. What was lost? The decline of Roman salt logistics reminds us of something crucial. Empires do not collapse in fire, they erode. A missing salt barrel does not spark a rebellion, but 100 missing barrels spread across a decade, across 100 outposts, create a silence that no trumpet can cover. In that silence, officers rewrite reports to hide missing stock. Soldiers turn to local chiefs for better deals. Forts empty, slowly and without notice. A general wakes to find he has only half the men he thought he did. And across the provinces, a new kind of soldier rises, one who no longer expects salt from Rome. Salt in us. You listening now might wonder, could something this small still matter today? Yes, infrastructure always matters. Salt is a symbol, a proxy for the fragile dependencies that tie societies together: clean water, reliable transport, fair distribution. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of missing salt, but its inability to fix that problem showed how brittle it had become. In many ways, that's the lesson. Empires are only as strong as the least glamorous part of their systems. And salt, it may have been the most boring ingredient in the empire, but it was also the most essential. Picture it one last time. A soldier stands at a muddy outpost on the far edge of the world. He's waiting again. A supply clerk counts crates. A messenger rides in tired. No barrels. The quartermaster shrugs. Next month, he says. But everyone knows it won't come. They chew their bread dry. And they wait quietly for something that no longer arrives. In the Russian Empire, infrastructure was often a promise, not a reality. Stretching across 11 time zones, from the icy wastes of Siberia to the marshlands of the Baltic, the empire's geography posed formidable challenges. Roads sank into mud. Rivers froze half the year. Forests became impassable thickets. And yet, orders from St. Petersburg or Moscow insisted that stone cathedrals be built, bells cast and hoisted, railroads laid, and bridges completed whether or not the earth cooperated. This is the story of a bell that was never heard, a project that took decades to complete but ultimately failed to fulfill its most basic function, to ring. And in telling this tale, we uncover a broader pattern of imperial ambition undermined by poor planning, geographic indifference, and the sheer size of Russia itself. This is not the story of war or revolution. It is the story of a cracked foundation, a poorly cast bell, and hundreds of frozen workers with nowhere to put their tools. Ivan's dream, building the Tsar bell. To begin this story, we must go back to the early 18th century, a time of grand transformation. Peter the Great had shifted Russia's gaze westward. He built St. Petersburg in a swamp. He imported engineers from France, architects from Italy, and clockmakers from England. Russia would be modern, orderly, and imperial. And yet, the basic systems required to sustain that modernity, roads, logistics, heating, remained deeply unreliable. In 1730, Peter's niece Empress Anna decided to build a new, colossal cathedral bell for the Kremlin. It would outshine anything made in Western Europe. It would weigh over 200 tons. It would ring in the glory of Russia's divine right to rule. It would be, quite literally, the voice of God in bronze. And so began the project to cast the Tsar bell, Tsarsky Kolokol, the largest bell ever attempted in human history. But from the start, it was doomed. First, the pit. To cast a bell of such magnitude required a casting pit 30 feet deep. This was dug in the Kremlin courtyard during late autumn just before the ground froze. The foundation was unstable from the outset. Water pooled beneath the mold. Frost heaved the base unevenly. Attempts to shore it up with timber failed. But the casting continued anyway. In November 1735, the molten bronze, over 200,000 kilograms of it, was poured into the pit. The process took over 30 hours, with dozens of workers pouring, adjusting, and hopping. Snow fell during the final stage, chilling the upper layer and creating temperature differentials across the bell's surface. The result? A hairline crack invisible at first, but fatal. And yet, Empress Anna was told the casting had been a success. The bell was left in the pit to cool for over a year, sealed in place by a temporary brick structure to protect it from the weather. Then the fire. In 1737, disaster struck. A fire swept through the Kremlin. Fearing that the wooden structure over the bell pit would ignite and damage the fragile bronze, workers threw cold water directly onto the mold, attempting to prevent the fire from reaching it. The result? A violent temperature shock. The bell's already weakened bronze fractured further. A massive 11-ton chunk broke off. The bell had never been raised, never been rung, and now it never would be. It sat broken, massive, and useless in its pit for nearly a century. The problem behind the problem. The Tsar bell is a tragedy in metal, but it was also a metaphor. Its failure wasn't just about cracks or temperature, it was about Russian infrastructure itself, where imperial ambition constantly collided with environmental and logistical indifference. Why did this happen? Because the systems that were supposed to prevent it, logistical planning, engineering assessment, seasonal scheduling, simply did not exist in a reliable form. Let's examine some of the structural patterns behind this one broken bell. Centralized decision-making. Most infrastructure was dictated from the imperial center. Local engineers had little say. If the Tsar or Tsarina wanted a bell in November, then by God, it would be poured even if the ground was frozen and the mold unready. Imported expertise, ignored advice. Foreign engineers were often brought in but overruled by Russian court officials. In the case of the Tsar bell, both Russian and French metallurgists warned against casting during winter. Their warnings were dismissed. Seasonal misalignment. Russian winters are not just cold, they're destructive. Infrastructure laid too late in the year often cracked, sunk, or warped. The Bell's pit was never meant to survive the frost heave of a Moscow winter. Lack of maintenance infrastructure. Even once built, Russian infrastructure struggled to last. Roads washed out in spring, bridges collapsed under snow loads, and there was no effective ministry to repair or assess structural integrity beyond the initial build. Display over function. Russia's ruling elite often prioritized symbolism over use. The bell was not just meant to ring, it was meant to demonstrate Russia's greatness to the world. That it would not ring became secondary. Elsewhere in the empire, roads to nowhere. The Tsar Bell wasn't the only project plagued by these issues. Across 18th and 19th century Russia, failed or incomplete infrastructure projects dotted the landscape. Dry canals in central Russia dug to link rivers, but never completed due to poor planning or floods. Bridges over frozen rivers, whose supports cracked each spring thaw. Winter-only roads, which were impassable during mud season, rendering whole provinces isolated for weeks. Telegraph lines, snapped by snow load and ignored for years. In one case, a 1790s project to build a road from Tula to Kazan stopped abruptly when funding ran out. The completed section, 130 kilometers long, ended in a marsh, with no ferry, no bridge, and no onward connection. Locals called it the Emperor's Path to Fog. Workers in the cold. Infrastructure failure in Russia also meant human cost. The Tsar Bell project employed hundreds of serfs. Most worked in freezing conditions with minimal shelter. Many died from exposure or injuries during casting. Their names were never recorded. This, too, was a pattern. Canal diggers along the Volga, sent with no tents, froze in dugouts. Railway workers in Siberia slept in collapsed barracks and burned stolen railroad ties to stay alive. Church bell casters in Novgorod were fined if a bell cracked during cooling, but given no firewood to manage the temperature. Infrastructure in Russia, especially before the 20th century, often assumed that human life was expendable, another raw material, like timber or stone. A bell unburied. In 1836, nearly a century after it was cast, the Tsar Bell was finally hauled from its pit. Nicholas I had ordered it displayed, not as a working bell but as a monument. A special pedestal was designed, and the cracked bell, now weighing 201 tons, was placed beside the Ivan the Great bell tower in the Kremlin. It never rang, it never could. Today, tourists stand beside it and marvel at its size. Few know the full story, that this was not a bell that tolled for Russia's glory, but a symbol of how often its ambitions exceeded its means. And so the question lingers. What does it mean when the loudest bell in your empire can never make a sound? Russia, for all its imperial declarations and autocratic might, has always contended with a single, unavoidable opponent: its own geography. In the last section, we explored how the infamous Tsar Bell, cast grandly, cooled poorly, and never rung, came to symbolize the persistent tension between Russian ambition and logistical reality. But that bell was not an isolated failure. It was part of a systemic pattern, one in which massive investments of labor, material, and imperial will consistently faltered under environmental pressure, mismanagement, or simple lack of follow-through. In this section, we look beyond the bell to examine a wider field of failed infrastructure. Bridges that fell before they were used, railways that warped with frost, and canals dug into the wrong direction. And we'll see that the failures weren't always from ignorance, but often from a refusal to listen. The frozen empire. Russia's terrain offers some of the worst possible conditions for stable infrastructure. Permafrost in Siberia, which shifts and warps foundations unpredictably. Spring Rasputitsa mud season, when roads become rivers of sludge. Floodplains, where rivers change course or freeze solid for 6 months. Forested expanses that choke out surveyors and delay cart transport. And yet, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, czars, governors, and ministers demanded progress often modeled on Western European standards, without adapting to Russian conditions. This wasn't just wishful thinking, it was imperial mimicry. If France had canals, Russia must have canals. If England had iron railways, Russia must build them too. But in France and England the soil was stable, the seasons predictable, the distances short. In Russia, every kilometer was a negotiation with nature. The canal to nowhere. One early example of costly failure was the Vishny-Volochyok waterway, expanded heavily in the 18th century under Peter the Great. Designed to connect the Baltic and Volga basins, it was a feat of digging and lock construction across marshy land. But the canal suffered from silt buildup, which was never adequately dredged, rotting timber locks constructed from soft pine, freezing damage, which cracked stonework annually, log jams, as canal-side forests collapsed into the water. It was passable for only a few months per year. The rest of the time, goods waited at depots, with salt, grain, and iron rusting or spoiling before they could be moved. One court record from 1779 shows a merchant suing the state over 27 barrels of salted herring spoiled on the Vishny due to inaction. By the early 1800s, portions of the canal had to be rebuilt completely. Some towns along the route were abandoned due to traffic loss. Railway by rule of autocrat. When Tsar Nicholas I began pursuing railways in the 1830s, he famously drew a ruler straight line on a map from St. Petersburg to Moscow and told his ministers, "That is where the railway shall go." The result was the Moscow-St. Petersburg Railway, completed in 1851. It became a symbol of modernity but also of deep logistical blindness. The problems began immediately. The ruler straight line ignored natural terrain and river crossings, requiring massive earthworks. Frost heaves warped the tracks each spring, creating rail blisters. Stations were placed at uneven distances, with no local context, some in marshes, others miles from any town. Ballast stone used beneath the rails was too soft, sourced from nearby but inadequate quarries. The government refused to import Western locomotives, instead insisting on Russian-built models which lacked efficiency and broke down constantly. Trains ran late, loads were restricted, over 40% of the line had to be retrofitted within the first 10 years. A French engineer, observing the project, wrote dryly, "It is a straight line, but perhaps too straight for a crooked land." Bridges of winter. Bridges in the Russian Empire posed another unique challenge. They had to survive two climates: Arctic cold and spring thaw. A notable example was the Volga River Bridge at Syzran, begun in 1876. Engineers misjudged the thickness of winter ice, anchored footings into semi-frozen soil that would liquefy in spring, failed to factor in ice flow pressure. In its second year of use, two piers collapsed. A supply train, loaded with salt and iron for Southern troops, plunged into the icy river. The records note 14 drowned workers and total loss of cargo. The bridge was later rebuilt longer, with stone piers, but only after massive public embarrassment. It was one of dozens of such failures across imperial infrastructure. Bureaucracy over engineering. Why did these failures keep happening? Because in Russia, engineering was subordinate to imperial order. Decisions were filtered through layers of bureaucracy. Ministry of Transport, regional governors, imperial accountants, oversight committees, often staffed by nobility with no technical background. A proposal to widen a canal, for example, might require a petition to the district administrator, a review by the ministry, a recommendation from the Imperial Academy, a signature from the Tsar's office. This process could take years. By the time approvals came, the project site might be flooded, frozen, or politically irrelevant. And engineers, meanwhile, were often foreigners with limited Russian literacy, or locals with classical training but no practical field experience. One complaint from 1825, written by a Baltic German engineer, says, "The stone is ordered, the masons are paid, but the bridge will never be built because the ministry insists on Latin inscriptions before it approves design." Lives along the line. Behind every failed bridge or sunken railed was a mass of unrecorded laborers. Peasant conscripts dragged timber without boots. Prisoners in Siberia dug tunnels with frostbitten hands. Tatars and Bashkirs, forced into supply labor, delivered tools to nowhere. Salaries were late. Shelter was scarce. In one case, during the construction of the Murmansk Railway much later, in 1915, over 10,000 workers died from exposure, illness, or starvation, yet this story echoes the same pattern from centuries before. No project could last if it ignored the workers who built it. The bell again. And so we return to the Tsar bell, not as an object, but as a symbol of how things were done. Cast before the foundation was ready. Damaged by an event no one anticipated. Left buried for decades. Finally displayed not for use, but as monumental silence. This was how Russian infrastructure often worked. Grand in intent, unprepared for execution, and ultimately repurposed for show. So when you walk today along a rebuilt rail line in Russia, or cross a stone bridge that once failed, or stand beside the massive bell that never rang, you are walking through a world not of defeat, but of persistence through dysfunction. Because Russia never stopped building. It just built crooked lines through crooked lands. The Tsar bell still sits in the Kremlin, a massive, immobile monument to a vision that never fulfilled its purpose. Tourists take photos beside it. Children climb its broken edges. Its 11-ton missing chunk is now part of its legend, but no one hears it. It has never rung, not once. And yet, it has echoed across Russian history. In this final section, we examine how the bell and the long lineage of failed or fragile infrastructure projects that surrounded it didn't disappear into obscurity. Instead, they became part of a uniquely Russian experience, a cultural legacy built not on what was completed, but what almost was. We'll consider how failure turned into folklore, how silence became symbolism, and how even the most broken projects left deep grooves in the collective memory of the Russian people. From function to symbol. In time, the Tsar bell was no longer seen as a failure. By the 19th century, Russian thinkers and artists began to reinterpret broken infrastructure not as shameful, but as metaphorical. The bell became a symbol of imperial ambition, both mighty and unfulfilled. A metaphor for potential silenced by poor execution. A reflection of human effort crushed by the elements. Writers like Nikolai Gogol and later Fyodor Dostoevsky explored similar themes in their fiction. Grandeur undermined by bureaucratic inertia, spiritual yearning muffled by material confusion. The bell was real, but it resonated with a nation used to seeing dreams tempered by delay. It even inspired poems. One 19th-century verse reads, "Great bell cast wide, you do not ring. No hymn you call, no sound you sing. Yet still we gather at your base. To mourn the silence we embrace." The idea of something meant to be but never made real struck a chord in a country where promises were often broken by snow, mud, and orders written in triplicate. Infrastructure as memory. Other broken projects gained similar mythic status. The unfinished railway to Arkhangelsk, halted by ice and famine, became a story of perseverance, how workers built shelter from abandoned sleepers and survived a winter with only dried mushrooms and snowmelt. The canal near Vitegra, completed but never used due to poor gradient calculation, was nicknamed the Canal of Stillness by locals. Children swam in it, elders cursed it. The bridge over the Amur River, which collapsed twice before completion, featured in folk songs as the bridge that hates horses. These stories passed not through official histories, but through memory, song, and oral tradition. They became warnings, jokes, and shared burdens. In Russia, even infrastructure has a soul, and sometimes that soul is weary, silent, or rusting. The Soviet echo. The Soviet Union, inheriting the bones of the Tsarist system, also inherited its infrastructural fragility. And it continued the cycle. Grand promises, immense labor, stunning logistical achievement mixed with striking, preventable failures. The White Sea, Baltic Canal, completed in the 1930s using forced labor, was built quickly but too shallow for major shipping. Thousands died digging it, only for it to carry almost no useful cargo. The Palace of the Soviets, intended to be the tallest building in the world, was begun on the ruins of a demolished cathedral but never finished. Its steel was later used to build bridges during WWII. The Trans-Siberian Railway, a marvel of perseverance, suffered from long sections laid on unstable permafrost, requiring near-constant repair. These stories echoed the bell, massive, symbolic, and often functionally mute. What failure teaches. To live with failed infrastructure is to live with inconvenience that becomes routine. Over time, Russians learned to navigate the broken parts. Workarounds became standard. Farmers created seasonal trails around impassable roads. Fishermen dug unofficial canals. Irony became protection. When a village pump failed, residents jokingly renamed the square the fountain. Language adapted. A plan described as built like the bell meant it was bold, expensive, and unlikely to succeed. In this way, infrastructure failure entered the language not only of speech, but of national self-perception. The Tsar bell became more than a bell. It became a cultural checkpoint, a reminder that even the grandest ideas must rest on something solid. A stillness that speaks. Standing beside the bell today, you can run your hand over its cracked surface. You can trace the intricate reliefs of saints and scrollwork. You can crouch and step inside an echo chamber that speaks nothing back. It's heavy, cold, immense. But most of all, it's quiet. And in that quiet, you begin to understand what it meant to cast such a thing in a time without cranes, to dig a pit in frozen earth, to pour molten bronze under imperial pressure, and to watch it crack not from malice, but from misjudgment, cold, and haste. It was meant to call the faithful. Instead, it reminds the observant. Final reflections. What does it mean when the bell never rings? Perhaps this is the question history asks us, not why a project failed, but what its failure taught the people who lived with it. The Tsar bell never rang, but its silence has lasted almost 3 centuries. And in that silence you can hear the rumble of frost beneath a crumbling bridge, the groan of iron tracks warped by thaw, the whisper of workers packing tools into crates, told the job is finished, though nothing was completed, and the quiet, enduring patience of a people used to building anyway. Russia endured not in spite of its broken infrastructure, but alongside it, as if learning to live with the unfinished was a national art. And maybe, just maybe, that bell is still waiting for the moment it can finally sound. Most wars are fought over land, ideology, or power, but occasionally, conflict curdles from something more dairy-based. Welcome to the curious, mostly forgotten world of the cheese war, a diplomatic standoff in early 1930s Europe that, while never officially declared a war, resulted in trade embargoes, retaliatory tariffs, and widespread public outrage all over cheese. This was not a war of bullets or borders, but of bureaucrats, butterfat, and bureaucratic miscommunication. And though its story may seem small, It reflects the slow, strange wheels of international policy, the fragility of food diplomacy, and how something as mundane as dairy quotas can, briefly, shape history. Let us begin in the Alps specifically, the border between Switzerland and Germany where cows graze, clocks tick, and somewhere deep in the corridors of commerce, someone was very upset about Emmentaler cheese. The dairy background. In the early 20th century, Switzerland had built an international reputation for its dairy products, particularly cheese. Emmentaler, with its signature holes and nutty flavor, was shipped across the continent. Gruyere was prized by chefs from Paris to Prague. Swiss milk powder and condensed milk were key ingredients in infant nutrition. The Swiss dairy industry was tightly regulated, with cooperatives and export boards controlling production and pricing. Meanwhile, Germany, still recovering from World War I and facing economic turmoil, was trying to protect its domestic agriculture. German farmers, especially in Bavaria and the Black Forest, argued that cheap imported Swiss cheese was undercutting local producers. The German government listened. In 1930, it passed a quiet but devastating trade measure, a tariff increase on imported dairy, specifically targeting hard cheeses from Switzerland. The first block. At first, it didn't seem like much. Tariffs were common, countries adjusted them regularly, but this one hit a nerve. It increased duties on Swiss cheese by over 50%, pricing it out of German markets. It excluded other foreign cheeses like Dutch Edam and French, raising questions of favoritism. And it came with no warning to the Swiss Dairy Export Union, which had just signed a long-term contract with German distributors. Swiss cheesemakers, particularly those in the Emmental region, were outraged. Thousands of wheels already in transport had to be returned, sold at a loss, or dumped. Small cooperatives collapsed. Farmers protested in Bern, wielding wooden cheese wheels as banners. The Swiss government demanded a diplomatic explanation. The German reply was terse: domestic interest requires adjustment. And so began the cheese war. How cheese becomes geopolitical. The Swiss response was swift, not militarily but economically. In April 1931, Switzerland imposed countertariffs on German beer, German sausage and cured meats, steel cutlery and machine parts, items frequently exported to Swiss factories. The choices were intentional. Swiss officials targeted goods with symbolic and practical value, just as cheese had symbolic weight in Switzerland. Beer and bratwurst held similar resonance in Germany. This wasn't just trade retaliation, it was cultural tit-for-tat. The press dubbed it Die Käsekrise, the cheese crisis. Political cartoons showed cheese wheels blocking border crossings. One popular image depicted a giant wedge of Emmentaler toppling a line of German customs officers. Still, the situation might have calmed except for the cows. A cow at the border. In May 1931, a Swiss dairy farmer near the German border attempted to lead several prize cows across to a breeding farm in Baden-Württemberg. Customs officials, interpreting the cheese embargo broadly, seized the cows and refused entry, claiming the animals represented a form of dairy trade. The cows were held for 9 days, housed in a customs impound pasture. The Swiss farmer, desperate and angry, gave interviews to local newspapers and the story exploded. In Zurich, a satirical play titled Die Kuh im Zaun, The Cow in the Fence, opened to sell out crowds. The German government, embarrassed, released the cows. But the damage was done. What began as an obscure tariff dispute was now a national issue in both countries. Swiss nationalist parties accused Germany of economic bullying. German agrarian groups accused the Swiss of dairy nationalism. Tensions escalated. Bureaucrats in a bind. Inside ministries in Berlin and Bern, Mid-level bureaucrats were now stuck in an absurd bind. Swiss export officials were attempting to negotiate cheese quotas, while newspapers demanded firm retaliation. German agricultural ministers were pressured by local dairy unions to keep Swiss cheese out permanently. Diplomats tried to stage meetings, but each side refused to enter talks until certain tariffs were lifted. One memo from the Swiss Ministry of Trade reads, "We cannot accept a resolution that treats Emmentaler as contraband. It is not a weapon, it is nourishment." Meanwhile, surplus cheese stocks piled up in Swiss warehouses. Some was sold off at low prices to Czechoslovakia and Italy, but much of it spoiled. By late 1931, estimates suggest over 2,000 metric tons of hard cheese were wasted due to lost export opportunities. That's more than 200,000 wheels each, a symbol of bureaucratic intransigence. Economic consequences. Beyond symbolism, the cheese war had real consequences. Swiss rural economies suffered disproportionately. In some cantons, dairy represented over 70% of local exports. German beer exports to Switzerland plummeted. One Bavarian brewery closed entirely due to loss of cross-border sales. Tourism declined. Swiss-German border towns reported fewer visitors as tensions rose. Customs staffing doubled, as officials manually inspected every crate of cheese or sausage crossing the border. There were even black market cheese operations, smuggling wheels across alpine trails or disguising Emmentaler as alpine wax product to avoid scrutiny. All over cheese. By early 1932, public frustration on both sides reached a tipping point. One editorial in the New Zürcher Zeitung asked, "Are we to risk friendship, economy, and culture over holes in cheese?" The German press, too, began to mock the situation. A Berliner paper published a satire piece titled "The Great Cheese Curtain," portraying the Swiss border as walled off by a rising stack of Emmentaler. Finally, after nearly 2 years, cooler heads prevailed. In a series of quiet backroom negotiations held in Basel, the two nations agreed to restore limited dairy trade, including capped quotas for Swiss hard cheese, lift countertariffs on beer, sausages, and machinery, create a bilateral dairy board to handle future trade disputes, possibly the first such board in European history. The cheese war officially ended in late 1932. No shots were fired, no treaties signed, just a slow return to normal as cheese shipments resumed and tariffs faded from public memory. But the question remains, how did so much effort, so much loss, and so much diplomatic frustration come from something as humble as cheese? When the cheese war began, few imagined that the humble wheel of Emmentaler would become a symbol of economic tension, national pride, and administrative absurdity. But the roots of this conflict ran deeper than customs and tariffs. It was also about identity, protectionism, and the broader struggle between traditional production and industrial regulation. In this section, we'll dig into the finer details of the trade policies, the cultural meaning of cheese in Switzerland and Germany, and how a seemingly benign foodstuff became a vehicle for debates about sovereignty, purity, and the future of agriculture in interwar Europe. Yes, cheese was at the center, but around it swirled the very question of modern nationhood. Cheese as cultural identity. To understand the passion behind the cheese war, we must recognize cheese as more than food. It was a cornerstone of identity, especially for the Swiss. Switzerland is not a single language or ethnicity. It's a confederation of cantons with distinct traditions. But dairy, especially cheese, was one of the few shared symbols across the linguistic and regional divides. Emmentaler from the Bernese Alps, Gruyere from the Romandy, Appenzeller from the East. Each cheese was a culinary badge of place. Moreover, most cheeses were still made in village cooperatives, where families pooled milk and shared in production. A wheel of cheese wasn't just a product, it was the output of community life. So when Germany blocked these exports, it wasn't seen merely as a financial inconvenience, it felt like an attack on tradition. By contrast, Germany's cheese industry was shifting toward larger-scale production, with increasing use of pasteurization and uniform standards. The German Agricultural Ministry had begun to view unpasteurized imports like Swiss raw milk cheeses as potentially unsanitary or non-compliant with evolving food safety regulations. Thus, beneath the tariff dispute lay a deeper tension: rustic authenticity versus industrial modernization. The Great Pasteurization Debate. In 1931, Germany's food inspectors began requiring all imported cheese to meet new, hygienic standards, which, while never explicitly targeting Switzerland, created major obstacles for traditional cheesemakers. Emmentaler, made in open-air dairies, often with raw milk and aged in caves, could not easily meet the new certifications. Swiss cheese cooperatives balked at the cost and changes required for compliance. German importers feared fines and seized shipments if they continued bringing in non-compliant cheese. Swiss officials protested, calling the regulations arbitrary and accusing Berlin of using food safety as a pretext for economic protectionism. One particularly dramatic moment came when German inspectors destroyed a shipment of cheese at the Hamburg port by pouring acid over the wheels, an act that sparked outrage in Swiss newspapers and was likened, perhaps overdramatically, to book burning. Swiss cheesemakers demanded their government respond. Some called for dairy embargoes on Germany, while others proposed mandatory pasteurization as a way to appease the German market. This became the central dilemma. Should Switzerland modernize its cheese or protect its traditional methods? Political ripples. As the cheese war entered its second year, its effects began to seep into broader political debates. In Switzerland, right-wing nationalist parties used the cheese dispute to campaign for economic self-sufficiency, promoting slogans like "Swiss milk for Swiss homes." Left-wing critics argued that the whole conflict proved the fragility of export dependence and called for subsidies for domestic consumption instead. Rural cooperatives staged symbolic protests, some even dumped milk in public squares, to highlight the waste caused by blocked exports. In Germany, Bavarian farmers called for a complete ban on all foreign dairy, citing disease risk and moral economy. Central government officials were caught between satisfying these protectionist demands and maintaining diplomatic ties with one of Germany's few neutral neighbors. Industrial dairy firms, many of them in northern Germany, secretly supported the Swiss position, since it helped weaken southern competitors. The cheese war thus became a prism through which broader tensions in Europe played out: rural vs. urban, tradition versus modernity, regulation versus free trade. The role of the press. Media played a crucial role in escalating and eventually diffusing the cheese war. Swiss newspapers followed every development with theatrical seriousness. Editorials carried headlines such as "Germany blocks culture of the Alps," "Cheese crisis threatens peace," "Emmentaler held hostage in Hamburg." In Germany, the tabloid press mocked the Swiss as cheese nationalists and warned readers of uncontrolled bacteria from Alpine smugglers. Satirists on both sides had a field day. One German humor magazine published a mock treaty that included provisions like, "The Swiss shall henceforth equip all cheese wheels with passports and visas. No holes shall exceed 2 cm in diameter without supervision." In Switzerland, a musical revue titled "The Smuggler of St. Gallen" told the story of a fictional dairy farmer sneaking cheese across the border disguised as luggage. Amidst this, voices of moderation began to emerge. A joint editorial published in both Neue Zürcher Zeitung and Frankfurter Zeitung in late 1932 called for a return to reason and a recognition that food is not war. A glimmer of resolution. Ironically, it was the economy itself that forced resolution. By 1932, both Germany and Switzerland were feeling the effects of the global depression. Germany needed machine tools and precision parts from Switzerland. Swiss tourism, heavily reliant on German visitors, had declined, putting pressure on ski resorts and hotel owners. Cheese rot and beer surplus reached unsustainable levels. Quiet negotiations began this time outside of public view. Mid-level bureaucrats, weary from nearly 2 years of back and forth, began to craft compromise solutions. These included allowing limited imports of certified, cooperative-made Swiss cheeses into Germany, lifting the most severe counter-tariffs on German goods, establishing a joint inspection commission to standardize dairy safety requirements. By spring 1933, trade resumed, albeit cautiously. Emmentaler was back on German plates, and Swiss ski lodges began to see a trickle of German tourists return. The cheese war, while never formally declared, was effectively over. But why did it happen? Looking back, historians often ask, why did this conflict arise at all? There are many technical answers: tariffs, hygiene laws, market protection, but the deeper reason may lie in something more human. A sense of ownership over tradition. A fear of losing local culture to modern regulations. The way symbols of everyday life, like cheese, can come to represent larger existential anxieties. After all, cheese is never just cheese. It is place, process, people. In the next section, we'll explore the lasting legacies of the cheese war, how it influenced European trade diplomacy, and how food fights, though often forgotten, can shape the rhythms of everyday history. But for now, consider this. What does it mean for a nation when the thing it exports most proudly is refused at the border? By the spring of 1933, the cheese war had melted into history. Swiss cheese returned gradually to German markets. The Swiss lifted their retaliatory duties on bratwurst and beer. Customs officials who had once measured whole diameters now turned their attention to other tasks. But what remained behind wasn't just the memory of a bureaucratic spat over dairy products. The cheese war left enduring marks on policy, on trade, and on how nations thought about something as seemingly innocuous as food. In this final section, we explore the war's legacy, the institutions it quietly helped shape, the ripple effects across Europe, and the evolving role of food in international diplomacy. We'll end by reflecting on the meaning of the cheese war not just as a curiosity of economic history, but as a slow-burning example of how even the dullest policy can shape lives and futures. A blueprint for dairy diplomacy. Out of the rubble of tariffs and embargoes came something rare for interwar Europe: cooperation. One of the key outcomes of the cheese war was the creation of the Swiss-German Dairy Coordination Commission, a joint panel composed of Swiss cooperative leaders, German agricultural regulators, public health officials from both sides, trade diplomats tasked with resolving technical disagreements. While modest in scope, it represented one of the first multinational efforts in Europe to regulate a specific category of agricultural trade through mutual standards rather than punitive tariffs. The commission met biannually, rotating between Lucerne and Munich. Its early topics included acceptable levels of humidity in aged cheese, transit permits for unpasteurized goods, mutual recognition of dairy inspection protocols. Surprisingly, these discussions became a model. Within a few years, other nations such as Austria, Czechoslovakia, and France began forming similar bilateral food product commissions. Though each was unique, the The Swiss-German panel was often cited as a precursor to European food standards coordination. It is no exaggeration to say that the cheese war laid early groundwork for what would later become the Codex Alimentarius, a global set of food safety standards developed under the UN in the post-war era. All from a trade spat over Gruyere. The cheese underground. While the diplomatic dust settled, another legacy persisted in whispers and alleys, the smuggler culture that flourished during the embargo years. Even after the trade resumed, many border communities maintained their informal networks for moving cheese and sausage across poorly patrolled trails in the Alps and Black Forest. Known locally as the Milchpfad or Milk Path, these clandestine routes became part of local folklore. Farmers and mule handlers from regions like Appenzell and Allgäu passed stories of night crossings, false bottom wagons, and hidden cheese caches in forest chapels. Over time, these tales were romanticized. In the 1950s, a Swiss novelist published Wheels in the Fog, a fictionalized account of two teenage smugglers moving cheese into Germany under the noses of customs officers. It became a bestseller. Today, some hiking trails in Switzerland are still marked with tongue-in-cheek signs referencing contraband cheese trails. A few border museums even display confiscated wheels with forged Bavarian labels. Economic lessons from dairy tension. Economists today view the cheese war as a textbook example of non-military economic conflict, a low-stakes trade war with asymmetric impacts. Key observations include: high symbolic goods, like cheese, beer, and sausages, carry disproportionate emotional and cultural weight, even if their financial volume is modest. Tariff battles, especially in essential commodities, can undermine rural economies quickly and irreparably. Escalation happens easily when goods are personified. Cheese was treated not as a product, but as a national emissary. In business schools, the cheese war is sometimes studied alongside more modern examples such as banana trade disputes in the EU or the chicken wars between the US and Europe in the 1960s. Each case follows a similar pattern. Policy shifts targeting one product. Disproportionate political reaction. Media frenzy amplifying public sentiment. Prolonged standoff. Resolution through low-level diplomacy and institutional compromise. In other words, boring wars require boring endings, negotiation tables, not treaties, standards, not speeches. Cheese as Cold War commentary. Curiously, decades later, the cheese war was revived not in conflict, but in Cold War propaganda. In the 1970s, East German media occasionally referred to the cheese war as an example of Western capitalist absurdity. A 1975 documentary aired on DDR television, titled "The Hole in the Trade Wheel," used the cheese war to mock both West Germany and Swiss bourgeois nationalism. West German trade officials responded with some amusement, releasing statements clarifying that Emmentaler remains welcome in the Federal Republic. In 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell, a Swiss cultural delegation brought a gift of 88 wheels of Emmentaler to East Berlin City Hall, one for each year since the original conflict. Though symbolic, the gesture was warmly received. The war that spoiled 200,000 wheels. All told, historians estimate that over 200,000 wheels of Swiss cheese were wasted or undersold during the two-year standoff. Many were sold to third-party countries at discounted rates, some were stored in caves until spoilage, and others were destroyed outright to maintain price stability. In 1932, the Swiss government even explored repurposing spoiled cheese into animal feed or industrial lubricant, though most trials failed. In one incident, cows reportedly refused to eat feed blended with aged Emmentaler shavings. The economic toll was real. For smaller cantons like Nidwalden or Obwalden, whose economies leaned heavily on cheese. It took nearly a decade to rebuild cooperative strength. Yet strangely, the cheese industry came out stronger in the long run. The war had forced producers to organize, innovate, and diversify. By 1940, Switzerland had new export routes, better transport logistics, and a growing domestic market for high-quality aged cheeses that once were shipped abroad. In this way, a trade conflict that nearly destroyed the dairy industry also prepared it for 20th-century global competition. A final slice. So what do we learn from a war over cheese? That trade, however mundane it may seem, touches on deep ideas: pride, identity, food sovereignty, and cultural expression. That nations can draw lines not just over land, but over recipes, processes, and symbols. And that diplomacy isn't always driven by statesmen, but often by inspectors, farmers, and factory workers, just trying to move goods across invisible borders. The cheese war did not shape the century. It didn't topple regimes or redraw maps. But in its quiet way, it reminds us that even the boring parts of history, tariffs, dairy standards, municipal regulations, can leave marks that echo through economies, cultures, and memories. And maybe next time you bite into a slice of Emmentaler, you'll think just for a moment about how much diplomacy it took to get that cheese onto your plate. It is often said that revolutions are made by the people, fueled by passion, guided by ideology, and sealed with blood. But revolutions also run on something far more mundane: paper. Pamphlets, petitions, decrees, manifestos, these are the vessels through which movements move. Every revolutionary act, from the call to arms to the codification of new laws, requires documentation. Which is why, in the early years of the First French Republic, one of the greatest threats to the new regime wasn't royalist conspiracies, foreign armies, or internal rebellion. It was a massive shortage of paper. Welcome to one of the quietest yet most disruptive crises of post-revolutionary France, the period from 1793 to 1796, when bureaucrats were unable to issue laws, print identification cards, or even record births due to a critical lack of writing materials. At a time when France was attempting to rebuild itself from the rubble of monarchy, the Republic was quite literally running out of pages on which to write its future. A nation of forms and files. To understand how this happened, we must start by acknowledging the bureaucratic nature of revolutionary France. Though sparked by bold ideals and public revolt, the First Republic quickly became one of the most document-heavy governments in history. The National Convention, Committee of Public Safety, and various regional administrations issued proclamations of loyalty, citizenship papers, army conscription forms, certificates of marriage and divorce, newly legalized, tax records under the evolving Republican fiscal system. All of this was conducted in triplicate by hand. In 1792 alone, the central government printed over 38 million sheets of paper for official use. That's without counting the countless pamphlets, revolutionary newspapers, and anti-royalist broadsides distributed across the countryside. The revolution had overthrown an absolute monarchy, but inherited its love of meticulous records. In many cases, the new regime required even more documentation than the old one. Every citizen had to be identified, registered, counted, and monitored. As one observer wrote in 1793, "Never has liberty demanded so many ledgers." Collapse of the supply chain. And then, in the winter of 1793, the paper mills stopped. The causes were varied and interconnected. Many mills had been church-owned. Following the seizure of church lands during the Revolution, those enterprises were either shuttered or reorganized under chaotic conditions. The war with Austria, Britain, and Prussia disrupted imports of linen rags, a key raw material for paper production. Transportation networks. especially river barge routes, had been compromised due to military requisition and regional unrest. Skilled workers, typesetters, printers, and mill hands were often conscripted into the army or fled the unstable regions. And then came inflation. As the assignat currency plummeted in value, paper producers demanded payments in hard coin or barter. The government, awash in paper money but short on materials, couldn't comply. The result: by early 1794, dozens of departments reported no ability to produce or receive official documents. In Limoges, judges postponed trials because no record books were available. In Lyon, couples were turned away from marriage ceremonies due to a lack of certificates. In Paris itself, the Ministry of War announced that it would cease issuing printed conscription orders and would rely on town criers instead. The revolution, so obsessed with ink and parchment, had run aground on the shoals of stationery. The rag question. One of the more unusual aspects of this crisis was the role of rags which, before the industrialization of wood pulp paper, were essential for paper production. Most paper in late 18th century France was made from linen and cotton rags, shredded, pulped, and pressed. The revolution had disrupted both the collection and the processing of these materials. The National Convention issued a decree in June 1794 requiring all citizens to donate their old clothes, particularly undergarments, which produced high-quality pulp. Municipal officers went door to door collecting rags. But here, too, ideology met absurdity. Some citizens refused to donate their old clothes, claiming they were now Republican fabric and not to be sacrificed. Others sold rags on the black market, often smuggling them across borders where paper producers paid higher prices. A short-lived rag police was established in Bordeaux to seize hidden materials, but was mocked in the local press as the chiffon milice, the rag militia. Even as soldiers died on the frontier, the interior was engaged in a war over soiled linen. The bureaucrats' dilemma. While the Jacobins argued over liberty and the Girondins debated the economy, mid-level bureaucrats faced a more immediate challenge: how to keep the machinery of the state moving without any paper. Solutions were often desperate. Officials reused the blank sides of old royal decrees, even those with Bourbon seals still visible. Scrap paper was sewn together to create makeshift ledgers. Messages were sent orally or via chalkboards carried by messengers, who repeated the announcements aloud in public squares. In some regions, wood tablets or slate boards were temporarily employed to record tax payments erased and rewritten as needed. At the height of the crisis in 1795, the Department of the Somme was said to be functioning with only 14 usable sheets in its entire prefecture. An administrator in Avignon wrote, "We are a republic of ideas, but we lack the means to write them down." Revolutionary consequences. The shortage had broader impacts. Reform efforts stalled. Land redistribution programs could not proceed without proper registries. Education initiatives faltered. The newly declared secular schools had no slates, chalk, or textbooks. Press freedom declined, not from censorship, but from sheer material scarcity. Only a handful of newspapers could afford to publish regularly. Political accountability suffered, as citizens were unable to receive printed laws or register complaints. Ironically, the most literate revolution in European history was now running without documents. The consequences reached into the very legitimacy of the Republic. In a society trying to move from oral tradition to modern administration, the inability to put things in writing made law feel ephemeral, arbitrary. In the next section, we'll explore how France attempted to solve the crisis, how one forgotten administrator found an unlikely solution, and how paper production would become a cornerstone of the modern state. But for now, ask yourself this. What happens when a revolution, built on words and laws, has nothing left to write on? By mid-1795, France was a republic on the verge of administrative collapse, not from counter-revolution or foreign invasion, but from a far more anticlimactic cause: the near-total absence of paper. As previously described, entire departments were paralyzed. Citizens could not be registered, births could not be recorded, marriages could not be sanctioned, and revolutionary laws could not be distributed. France, in its effort to reinvent governance, had become a nation unable to file paperwork. Yet from this period of scarcity arose an unlikely class of heroes, not generals or politicians, but papermakers, municipal scribes, and a forgotten bureaucrat named Étienne-Nicolas Braimond, who helped set the foundation for France's modern paper infrastructure. In this section, we follow how Braimond and others worked to restore paper flow to the veins of the Republic, using ingenuity, compromise, and a surprising amount of shredded underwear. Étienne-Nicolas Braimond, the unsung functionary. Little is known about Braimond before 1794. He was born in Caen in 1759, educated in a minor seminary, and eventually employed by the General Directorate of Weights and Measures, an agency far from the heart of revolutionary power. But in 1795, Braimond was assigned to a special delegation under the Committee of Public Safety, the Office of Revolutionary Resources, a short-lived bureau created to address material shortages across France. While others focused on saltpeter, gunpowder, or bread grain, Braimond volunteered, some said with audible resignation, to oversee matters related to paper and writing implements. His assignment included surveying the state of France's paper mills, recommending emergency sources of pulp, coordinating rag collection, proposing substitute writing materials for government use. In short, Braimond became the paper czar of the revolution. Mapping the mills. Braimond's first act was ambitious: a national census of all paper mills, operational or otherwise. His team traveled by foot and horse across 46 departments, inspecting mills that had been abandoned, burned, or repurposed during the upheaval. Many were in ruin, deprived of workers, linen rags, or functioning presses. Others had turned to black market sales, printing pamphlets for private publishers rather than government contracts. What Braimond discovered was sobering. Of 322 mills operating under Louis XVI, only 87 were still active. Most remaining mills were running at 30% capacity or less. No standard pricing or requisition protocol existed. Rampant theft of linen pulp and forgery of paper credentials plagued distribution channels. He presented his findings to the National Convention in late 1795. The deputies reportedly listened in silence as he unfurled a single roll of parchment onto which he had meticulously inked a national flowchart of the French paper crisis. His conclusion was blunt: "We are attempting to govern a republic with less paper than a single nobleman's estate possessed in 1788. Rags, underwear, and incentives." In response, Braimond proposed a series of immediate interventions. Rag Incentive Program, RIP. Citizens were to be rewarded, not fined, for turning in old clothing. Each kilogram of linen or cotton rags could be exchanged for bread coupons, a revolutionary calendar poster, or modest tax relief. Mobile rag collectors. In regions with unrest or poor transport, Braimond dispatched rag brigades, wagons with official seals and clerks who bartered rags directly from villagers. Urban laundry reclamation. The government seized the contents of abandoned laundries and dry goods stores viewed as unused national textile resources. Pulp substitutes research. Braimond experimented with seaweed, mulberry bark, and pressed potato starch as emergency paper bases. Most failed, but he managed to create legible pulp from recycled old revolutionary posters. Though mocked at times especially for his campaign slogan, "Liberty requires linen," Bremen's programs worked. Rag supplies doubled by the spring of 1796, and over 20 idle mills were brought back online. Paper and propaganda. Paper's scarcity had deeply affected revolutionary media. Without printing stock, pamphleteers either ceased publication or resorted to ever smaller fonts, recycled issues, or wooden slips placed in public squares, sometimes written in chalk. Literacy surged during the Revolution, but reading material plummeted. Bremen encouraged the revival of press activity by directing new pulp supplies to regions with at least one active newspaper. He argued that, where ink flows, order follows. Some rural printers began hand-lettering micro-pamphlets on cut squares of used parchment, then binding them with corn husks or ribbon scraps. Known colloquially as fuels de famine, famine sheets, they became collectors' items after the crisis. The national printer, Imprimerie Nationale, resumed regular publication of Le Moniteur Universal, the Republic's official newspaper, by June 1796, thanks in part to Bremen's effort to centralize pulp distribution. Resurrecting the stationers. Another overlooked impact of the paper crisis was the near collapse of stationers and scribe guilds, those who produced and distributed notebooks, ledgers, pens, and ink across the country. Many had gone bankrupt or abandoned their posts due to lack of materials or fear of political reprisal. After all, printers had once been considered revolutionaries, then enemies, then vital again. Bremen created a modest registry of stationers, offering small grants and pulp allotments to businesses willing to reopen. He even authorized a Republican ledger design to standardize the look of government-bound notebooks, plain brown covers with the words "Pour la République, par la main du citoyen." For the Republic, by the hand of the citizen. Stationers became proud again, their shops adorned with miniature tricolor flags and signs reading, "Approved by the paper office." One Parisian scribe began embossing a profile of Bremen on his recycled parchment rolls. It was half mockery, half reverence. The return of documentation. By late 1796, key bureaucratic functions were slowly restored. Marriage records resumed across most departments. Conscription notices were printed and delivered on time. School materials slates, ink pots, primers were issued to the first generation of secular public schools. Citizen IDs, a hallmark of the surveillance-heavy republic, were once again uniformly issued. Revolutionary France was, at last, able to document itself again. Legacy of the paper crisis. Bremen's work didn't make him famous. He retired in 1799 and died in relative obscurity. But modern historians now credit his methods as early examples of emergency logistics, material prioritization, and public incentive programs during crises. His reports were later studied by Napoleonic administrators, and even referenced during WWI and WWII, when France faced similar shortages. More broadly, the crisis left a cultural mark. The French idiom "à court de papier," out of paper, became a euphemism for administrative impotence. Satirical prints depicted government ministers scribbling laws on their shirt sleeves. Novels and plays from the early 1800s poked fun at officials who swore loyalty, with a mouth full of ink and no paper to speak of. But perhaps most significantly, it revealed how much infrastructure sits behind ideology. No matter how noble the goals of a revolution, they must be printed, copied, and filed. In the next section, we'll explore how this paper crisis foreshadowed larger challenges of 19th-century governance, the growing complexity of modern bureaucracies, the rise of administrative centralization, and how France's obsession with documentation shaped the modern nation-state. But for now, ask yourself, in a world built on records, what happens to history when there's nothing to write it down on? By the time the 19th century dawned, France had survived war, economic collapse, famine, political purges, and yes, even a national paper shortage. What emerged from the bureaucratic wreckage was something new: not just a republic, not just an empire under Napoleon, but a state apparatus designed to endure crisis, document its citizens, and shape them in turn. In this final section of the story, we follow how the legacy of the paper crisis, so seemingly trivial, left a permanent imprint on governance. From new systems of archival preservation to standardized forms of identification, the shortage spurred innovations in administration and helped formalize how modern states collect, manage, and preserve information. It also raises a quiet but profound question. Did the failure of paper help invent the idea of the paperless state? The rise of bureaucratic centralization. In the wake of the Revolution, and in part as a response to the logistical chaos of the 1790s, France moved toward a more centralized and rational administrative system, one that placed records, accountability, and access to documentation at the heart of statecraft. Napoleon Bonaparte, who seized power in 1799, understood the lessons of the paper crisis well. His reforms were not merely military or legal, they were bureaucratic. Between 1800 and 1804, Napoleon's administration implemented a standardized civil code, requiring uniform paper-based legal documentation for all citizens. The creation of state-run printing offices in every department, prefectures in each department, whose primary task was to serve as hubs for information distribution and collection. An official system of national archives, consolidating fragmented Revolutionary-era records into a central repository in Paris. In a way, these developments were a direct response to the failures exposed during the crisis. Napoleon's belief in efficient state machinery required an abundant and well-organized supply of paper and the mechanisms to use it wisely. One scholar later wrote, "The Napoleonic state was a child of the Revolution, but it was weaned on reams of paper." A new archival consciousness. The trauma of lost records during the Revolution, many burned, looted, or abandoned, created an archival awakening in post-revolutionary France. In 1796, the Directory commissioned a full audit of existing state and ecclesiastical documents. What they found was alarming. Many birth, death, and marriage records had vanished in destroyed churches. Revolutionary decrees had been scattered across regions, with no central registry. War office records had been eaten by rats in poorly maintained basements. The response was the formal establishment of Les Archives Nationales, a dedicated national archive tasked with collecting, preserving, and cataloging France's documentary heritage. Archivists, once lowly clerks, were elevated in stature. They were now guardians of memory, ensuring that the Republic and later Empire would not again be paralyzed by lack of information or material. Special attention was paid to paper quality, with archivists insisting on acid-free, linen-based sheets and temperature-controlled vaults for the most vital documents. Some even argued for paper rationing protocols during emergencies, drawing directly from Bremen's reports. Though such laws were rarely enforced, they served as a reminder of what had been nearly lost. From ledgers to identity, paper and the citizen. Perhaps the most lasting effect of the paper shortage was its role in shaping how the modern French state conceived of citizenship, not just in a legal or ideological sense, but in a documentary one. By the early 1800s, to be a French citizen meant to be registered in a civil ledger, possessing an identity card, livret de citoyen, documented in a military or conscription record if eligible, included in tax rolls, birth registries, and later, education certificates. This formalization of identity was in stark contrast to pre-revolutionary France, where many rural peasants lived and died with minimal official record of their existence. The revolution's chaos had shown how a state could lose track of its people and how people could lose access to rights without paperwork. That fear never entirely faded. And so the citizen became legible through documents. French historian Pierre Rosanvallon later observed, "To govern the people, you had first to write them into being." Bureaucracy as a survival strategy. Far from being an unfortunate side effect, the French paper obsession became a mechanism for national cohesion in the 19th century. As revolutions came and went 1830, 1848, 1870, the bureaucracy persisted. Tax inspectors, census takers, registrars of births and deaths continued their work through regime change after regime change. The paper flowed, uninterrupted, even as kings rose and fell. Ironically, this boring infrastructure, the legacy of shortages and rag drives and emergency ledgers, may have been one of the most enduring products of revolutionary France. It provided a continuity of services, regardless of politics, a growing literacy in governance, as citizens interacted more frequently with paperwork, an embedded expectation that rights must be documented to be claimed. Indeed, for many working-class or rural citizens, their first true contact with the state came not through ideology, but through a piece of paper, a birth certificate, a summons, a tax bill, a school enrollment form. Echoes in the modern world. You may think this is ancient history, a quirk of an old regime, but the paper shortage of revolutionary France continues to echo in subtle ways today. During World War II, both occupied and Vichy France struggled with materials shortages, paper among them, prompting the revival of Bremen-style rationing. In post-colonial African states, many former French colonies inherited this deeply paper-based administrative culture, with civil registry systems still relying on similar documentation methods. Even in today's digital age, official documents in France, such as birth certificates or notarized contracts, are required in physical form, with specific paper types, margins, and ink colors. And of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, citizens once again carried government-issued paper passes to move between zones, reminders of just how central documentation remains, even now. Conclusion: paper, people, and power. So what, in the end, was the true legacy of France's paper crisis? It wasn't just about missing stationery or idle printing presses. It was about the fragility of systems that assume abundance, the arrogance of governments who believe that material logistics can be taken for granted, and the profound truth that every lofty revolution depends on someone somewhere having a working pen and a blank sheet of paper. It's also about what happens when those tools disappear, how quickly the machinery of liberty can seize up when the filing cabinet is empty. And so, the shortage that once stopped marriages, froze tax records, and halted laws also gave birth to a new awareness of the state as a document-producing entity, a consciousness that would stretch into the modern era. You may never have heard of Etienne Nicolas Brayment. You likely haven't handled a linen pulp ledger or read a civil code issued on seaweed parchment. But every time you show an ID, sign a form, or open a sealed envelope from a government office, you are living in a world that was shaped in part by the moment France ran out of paper.